It's a pleasure to present Harvey Siegel from the University of Miami, who will talk about epistemic rationality being not just instrumental. So,
great, thank you. I repeat everyone else's thanks to Carl and Thomas and Sven and Chiara. It's been a fantastic conference, and I'm honored to be here. I also have to say that Residencia de Investigadores is the most sexy name for a conference venue that I've ever had the pleasure of being at. I'm sorry to have to start having just learned from David that epistemic normativity isn't real normativity, but I'm just going to have to cope with that. So we're talking about epistemic normativity anyway. Okay, so, and my claim is going to be that epistemic rationality is not just instrumental. So, I begin with a kind of stage-setting move. It seems to me that whatever else we mean by the word rationality, it has to have something to do with reasons. I think Tom Kelly said something along these lines earlier today. I think any theory of rationality has to accept this as a constraint, that rationality is fundamentally a matter of reasons. And I'm not sure if you got did you get a handout? There's, oh, well, I'm sorry then. There's supposed to be handouts. Anyway, I have a bunch of quotes, most of which are on the slides, but some of which are not. But I'm thinking now that Sven is up that the handouts will appear in a minute. Anyway, all I wanted to say was the quotes are on the handouts, so you can read them at your leisure, both now and afterward. But here are some that make this claim. So Israel Scheffler writes that rationality is a matter of reasons. To take it as a fundamental education, so he's talking about education, is to make as pervasive as possible the free and critical quest for reasons. A quote from Larry Loudon, who isn't always thought of in this camp, but on this point he agrees that at its core, rationality consists in doing or believing things because we have good reasons for doing so. And Bob Nozick says, to speak of something, an action or belief as rational is to assess the reasons. Rationality is a matter of reasons. A mere preference for no reasons at all is irrational. So I take this to be not a particularly deep point, but a sort of constraint on a theory of rationality. If the theory doesn't take seriously the idea that rationality is a matter of reasons, then it's already off on a wrong foot. And there I say on the handout, no?
we're just looking. It was left under here, but no, I don't see it.
No, well, never mind. It's just a bunch of quotes. I'll try to indicate where that matters. I don't think it will. I thought the topic for today was, well, what's the relationship between epistemic rationality and instrumental rationality? And in particular, is epistemic rationality reducible to instrumental rationality? That is that all there is to epistemic rationality? And there are, in the history of philosophy, two important reasons that have been offered in favor of this view, both of which will be familiar to you. So the first one is it has to be instrumentally rational because there's no way to rationally evaluate ends, which are given by our preferences or desires, but only the means to those ends. And this will be a familiar quote from Aristotle. I think familiar to most of you. We deliberate not about ends, but about what promotes ends. And then he talks about a doctor and an orator and a politician. And the last line is, rather, we first lay down the end and then examine the ways and means to achieve it. So that's Aristotle. And then, of course, Hume's very famous quote, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Well, if the handout ever shows up, there's a nice quote from Russell and from Herbert Simon to the same effect. So that's the first reason to think that epistemic rationality must be instrumental, because there's no reasoning about ends. The second is what I'm calling the naturalistic constraint, according to which theorizing about normative matters must be conducted in scientifically respectable ways, and only instrumental rationality can meet this constraint. So here's a quote from Larry Loudon. The central issue is this: Siegel, that's me, following the dominant tradition, believes that it's possible to discover epistemological principles that are autonomous from science. Such principles would provide an autonomous warrant for normative claims as to how scientists should act. They would provide criteria for categorical or unconditional rationality among scientists. The naturalist, oh sorry, this is not Loudon, this is Geary, my apologies. The naturalist, by contrast, believes there is no autonomous realm of epistemological principles. This is not to deny that there are better and worse ways of attempting to do science or to reject the possibility of giving advice, but the corresponding principles of rationality are only instrumental or conditional. They connect research strategies with the goals of research, and establishing these connections itself requires scientific inquiry. And now here's Loudon saying essentially the same thing. Actually, here's a couple of quotes from Loudon that say that. And I'm not going to argue against these reasons here, although I think they both fail. The first one is obvious. We can and do rationally evaluate ends, and it's important that we do that. In fact, it's a philosophically important thing that we do. And the second one, I had a long back and forth with Loudon and Geary a long time ago. I won't repeat those arguments here. I'm happy to give the references if you want them. But I'm not going to talk about that now, because I want to talk about the positive case, or I guess I should say the negative case, for thinking that epistemic rationality is simply instrumental rationality. That is, I want to now give two reasons against the idea that epistemic rationality is simply a kind of instrumental rationality. So first, I'm certainly not the first person to say this or to hold this view. So here's a nice quote from Nozick. This is Nozick. Instrumental rationality is the default theory, the theory that all discussants of rationality can take for granted, whatever else they think, but there are also other legitimate modes of rationality, and hence the concept of rationality is not exhausted by the instrumental. I think that's right. That's the right view. That is, there's nothing wrong with instrumental rationality. It's perfectly respectable kind of reasoning, but it's not the whole story. And here are the two reasons that I want to defend. First, any assessment of instrumental rationality requires a non-instrumental relation between the reasons or the evidence offered and the target belief, action, or outcome alleged to be instrumentally rational. So think about a particular case. This is a case that Loudon first introduced. The case of using double-blind methodology. So he argued it's clearly rational for scientists to, of course, by now there's triple-blind methodology. It's a little more complicated than when Loudon was arguing. But still, his basic point is clear. It's instrumentally rational to use a double-blind research design rather than a single-blind design if the aim is to discover the actual medicinal properties of a newly discovered drug. So the question is why? What makes that instrumentally rational? And I think, and I could show you textual evidence if you insisted from Loudon, that his idea was, well, it's instrumentally rational to use the double-blind study because that design, the double-blind study, controls for a source of error that a single-blind design does not. And so it's more likely to get to the truth about the actual medicinal properties of the drug. So now the question is, why think that? Why should we think it's instrumentally rational to use the double-blind study? And the answer, it seems to me, is, well, because we have evidence that it's true. That is, we have evidence, call it E, that double-blind methodology controls for the placebo effect, which single-blind does not. It's this evidence that makes it rational to believe that M, which stands for methodology. So M is the claim that double-blind methodology is more instrumentally efficacious than single-blind with respect to the achievement of the goal, G, which is discovering the actual medicinal properties of the new compound. So consider now the relationship between M and G, between the methodology and the goal, right? The idea is it's a causal relation. If you want to find out what the drug's properties are, you're going to get the correct answer more often, at least, if you use double-blind methodology than single-blind, because it controls for source of error that single-blind does not, right? So now that claim is that double-blind methodology is more instrumentally efficacious than single-blind with respect to the goal of discovering the medicinal properties of the drug. So now consider that claim, that M is instrumentally efficacious with respect to G, right? Which is, I take it, we all think, and that's not controversial. What's the status of this claim, C? Why should we believe C? Why is it rational to believe C? I think the answer is clear. It's rational to believe C because of its relation to the evidence. E is the evidence that justifies the belief that C. That is, it's the evidence that M is indeed causally efficacious with respect to that goal, right? So the relation then between E and C is different, a different kind of relation than the relation between M and G. The relation between E and C is not one of instrumental efficacy. Rather, it's a straightforward evidential or probative relationship. E supports C. That is, it provides or constitutes a reason for thinking C true, and its support that epistemically justifies the belief that's C. So, if that's right, underlying relations of instrumental efficacy and claims concerning them are epistemic support relations involving such relations of instrumental efficacy. Okay, and now here I'm sort of saying that again in slightly other words. But to put the point slightly differently, there are two different relationships in play here. There's a causal, efficacious relationship, and then there's a probative, evidential relationship. And they're simply two different kinds of relations. And they bear different relations to each other. And it's only the evidential one that entitles us to think in terms of rationality. Right? The other one is a causal relation, which doesn't tell us anything about rationality. When we say it's rational to use the one that's causally efficacious, that's because we have reason for thinking that it's more efficacious. And that's the rational part of it. Right? Okay, so that's the first reason, I think. And now here again, just saying it again in slightly other words. And then the second reason is the reason that we talked about this morning, Tom Kelly's reasons. So I won't go through this in enormous detail because Tom did it so beautifully this morning. But Kelly's idea is that having evidence that P renders a belief epistemically rational. It's what I should believe. It would be epistemically irrational to not believe it, independently of any cognitive goals that I might have. And that Kelly paper of 2003 argues this thesis. So now I'm sorry that we don't have the handouts, just because the examples are beautifully laid out and they're very long, so too long to put on slides, so I don't have the slides, but I can talk about them very briefly. Russell's handedness is the question of Bertrand Russell. Was he right-handed or left-handed? And Kelly fills out the example in very nice detail. Basically, he's writing, he says, I don't care about whether Russell was left-handed or right-handed. I have no evidence for either way. I've never seen a picture with him holding a pen or writing with chalk on the chalkboard. I've never seen a comment about it in his autobiographical work. Right? And moreover, I don't care if he's right-handed, if he's left-handed, if he's ambidextrous, if he writes with his feet. I don't care, right? It's irrelevant to me. No goal of mine is furthered by my having a true belief about Russell's handedness. Nevertheless, Tom argues in this example, if I stumble upon such evidence, which is not really all that far-fetched. I mean, suppose you're looking in the Russell archives and you find a picture of him writing at the blackboard. Then you might have very good evidence about his handedness. But Tom's point is, evidence or not, I don't care. Sorry, not evidence. I take back the evidence or not. I don't care, but when I stumble upon that evidence, I now have good reason to believe that he's left-handed, if that's what the picture shows. And so it's epistemically rational to believe it, even though it furthers no goal of mine, right, to believe it. And then the late moviegoer is the case Tom talked about this morning. I go later than my friends. I'd rather not have the ending spoiled so I can enjoy the movie. So I try to avoid learning how it ended. But when my inconsiderate friend blurts out the ending, I now have evidence about how it ended. And so it's rational for me to believe that that's how it ended, even though my goals, my aims, are frustrated by that belief. I wanted not to know so I could see the movie innocently, so to speak. Nevertheless, once I get the testimonial evidence, I have good reason to believe something about how it ends. So those are the cases. And the examples, Kelly's example suggests that epistemic rationality is strictly a function of one's evidence or epistemic reasons. One's cognitive and other goals are irrelevant. Whatever my preferences or goals concerning beliefs about Russell's handedness or the movie's ending, once I acquire the evidence in question, what it's epistemically rational for me to believe is settled by that evidence, right? If so, it's epistemically rational, given my reasons and evidence, to believe that P. And that fact has nothing to do with my goals. That's the important thing. Whether or not my relevant goal is to believe truly, not believe falsely, not have inconsistent beliefs, not be Dutch booked, not ruin my enjoyment of the movie, or whatever, my evidence determines what I ought epistemically to believe. It's for this reason that epistemic rationality involves categorical, not instrumental or goal-relative reasons, right? And this is a nice quote from Kelly that summarizes this idea. He says, the attempt to assimilate epistemic rationality to instrumental rationality founders on the fact that one can have epistemic reasons to believe propositions even in cases in which it is clear that one's believing those propositions holds no promise of advancing any goal which one actually possesses. Okay, so those are the two reasons why I think we should reject the idea that epistemic rationality is strictly instrumental. But I now want to consider two replies on behalf of the instrumentalist. So, and I want to thank Tom for telling me. I thought this guy's name was Leidy, but Tom tells me it's Leet. So Adam Leet wrote a reply to Tom's paper. And Leet's argument rests on a distinction between what the evidence supports and what a person ought to believe, right? So the italicized expressions there. One can have very good evidence that P and yet have no reason to believe it. That's the thesis Leet is trying to defend. The former is the locus of Kelly's examples, he says, but if epistemic rationality is a matter of what one should believe, then, he suggests, even if I have strong evidence that P, I have no reason to believe it unless believing it advances some actual end of mine. And here's a nice quote from Leet that illustrates this point. He says, if you and I both know that all of the many previously observed emeralds have been green, then both of us know something which provides strong evidence that the next emerald to be observed will be green, and the instrumentalist can hold that this is so regardless of any differences which might exist in our respective goals. But the instrumentalist can plausibly hold that this shared evidence provides me with a reason to believe that the next emerald will be green, only insofar as I have a goal which would be served by believing what the evidence supports about this matter. So his idea is, well, let's just grant the evidence is evidence for the belief in question, still, if I don't have a goal that would be served by believing that proposition, then I have no reason to form the belief, right? So Leit's development of the point involves examples. He also has some very nice examples. You know, philosophers are very good at making up examples. He has examples of cases in which believers hear or otherwise acquire strong evidence about a candidate belief, but are simply unconcerned to form a belief about the matter. They're rather concerned about other things. So his point is that without such a concern, they cannot rightly be deemed irrational for not forming the relevant belief, despite the fact that they have strong supporting evidence for it. And I want to say in Leit's defense that his counterposition honors the first constraint on the theory of rationality that I mentioned earlier, namely that it has to be a matter of reasons, because his positive view is that a subject is not rightly deemed irrational for failing to form a belief if she has no reason to form a belief on the matter. So he too is connecting rationality with reasons. But here's what I think is misleading or just wrong about Leit's counter-argument. Why think she has no such reason, given the strong evidence she has? And I should point out that in that last line, there's an ambiguity lurking between no such reason to form the belief or no such reason to contemplate the belief or to consider the proposition. I'm going to clarify that in a minute. Why think that? I mean, that's actually, after all, Kelly's main claim, is that evidence qua evidence constitutes just such a reason. Whether or not I'm interested in the question whether P, the evidence renders my belief that P rational and my belief that P irrational once formed. So Leit may be right. I think we should just grant him that in the case in which I'm completely unconcerned with the question, it's not irrational for me to not form the relevant belief. As he says, having epistemic reasons to believe that P is having epistemic reasons to do something, to form a belief on a certain subject matter. But the mere possession of strong evidence doesn't give me a reason to form a belief. But, and here's my critical response to Leit, I think this way of framing the debate changes the subject. Right? The question at issue, I think, at least it's what I was thinking of when I wrote this paper, is that the question at issue is whether epistemic rationality can be reduced to or wholly characterized in terms of instrumental rationality. That's what we're debating, and that's what Leit took himself to be debating in the course of his discussion. So if you think, if the agent's question is, should I form a belief about this, and the matter is of no interest to her whatsoever, the answer might well be no. I don't care about it. It's not worth the effort. I shouldn't waste the cognitive resources. I shouldn't clutter my mind, as Anna Maria said earlier. I'm happy with that. That's all fine. But that's a different question. If the question is rather, should I believe that P, given my strong evidence for it, the answer seems obviously to be yes. And if the question is rather the deliberative question, what should I believe about this, then it seems the answer will surely depend on the evidence. So Leit's way of framing the issue, I think, changes the subject, changes the issue, making his claim a point about the potential believer's vulnerability to epistemic criticism in cases of inattention to or lack of interest in the candidate belief, rather than her vulnerability to epistemic criticism for failure to believe what her evidence supports when she's attending to that very matter. Right? So that distinction is what I think Leit conflates in his reply to Tom. So if this is right, then Leit's distinction between what the evidence supports and what one should believe, while perfectly legitimate, does not enable him to avoid Kelly's anti-reductionist conclusion. We can indeed distinguish between one's having evidence that P and one's having a reason to believe that P. I agree, we can draw that distinction. But if Kelly is right, the former is a special case of the latter. That is, my evidence that P, in and of itself, gives me reason to believe it. And that's the substance of Kelly's reply to Leet. I'm going to quote Tom again. Kelly puts the point in terms of the normativity of the concept of evidence. As he writes, evidence no less than reason for belief is itself a normative concept. I think that's been a point at issue in several of our talks at this conference. So if he's right about that, if Tom is right that evidence is also a normative concept, then having strong evidence that P itself constitutes or provides a reason to believe that P. So Leet's distinction does not accomplish its mission. And I think we should grant Leet, even if it's granted, that we can distinguish having evidence that supports P from having a reason to believe P, which I think is uncontroversial and undeniable. Of course we can distinguish them, since I may have a self-interested or practical reason to believe that P, which is not itself evidence that P is true, and may even fly in the face of the evidence I do have, it nevertheless remains that the evidence itself provides or constitutes a reason for believing what the evidence supports. And it's worth noting that Leet himself is a very unusual paper, his paper, because it's, as I read it anyway, he takes back everything in the last paragraph. It's worth noting that Leet, who makes clear that he is not himself committed to an instrumental conception, seems to give up his defense of such a conception in his closing paragraph. And this is the whole of that paragraph. So Leet writes, "The problem for this version of instrumentalism," when now my brackets filled out on analogy with rule rather than act utilitarianism, "it seems to me comes from the following thought. There are certain epistemic norms which govern us regardless of our goals, cognitive or otherwise. For instance, one epistemically should not believe that P in the face of what one regards as overwhelming evidence to the contrary, regardless of whether one has goals which would instrumentally justify accepting a norm to this effect. Or to put it in the idiom of epistemic reasons, overwhelming evidence that not P is decisive epistemic reason not to believe that P, regardless of any instrumental considerations at all. So even if one could provide these norms with an instrumental justification, doing so would miss something important, namely that the norms have authority over us in a way that does not depend on our goals. Rather, we are subject to them merely as believers." And I would have thought that that's exactly Kelly's point, or the rule utilitarian analog, that one's having decisive evidence that P gives one decisive reason to believe it. So it seems to me that we can grant Leet everything he wants in terms of distinctions, and the argument to the conclusion that epistemic rationality cannot be reduced to instrumental rationality still goes through. Okay, so that's the end of the discussion of Leet. Now I want to just mention very briefly a further objection to the anti-reduction to instrumental rationality position that Kelly and I are defending. This is not from Leet. It actually comes from a former student of mine, Josh Myers. He made a very nice, wrote a very nice paper to this effect, so I'm giving him a little free advertising. Leet's case for the instrumental conception presumes a descriptive, non-normative notion of evidence, according to which having evidence that P does not affect what one ought to believe independently of one's goals, right? And Kelly, as we've seen, rejects that analysis. He thinks evidence is itself a normative, reason to believe conferring concept, such that having strong evidence that P itself gives one good epistemic reason to believe it. One should believe it, precisely because one has strong evidence for it, whatever one's cognitive or other goals happen to be. So that raises a general question. Is evidence descriptive, normative, belief guiding? How should we think about that question? Does it tell us what we ought to believe? And the thought of my student, Myers, is that if you think that, if you think that evidence tells us what we ought to believe, then you should be worried that that conception of evidence places unreasonable demands on us, demands that ordinary believers cannot meet. One might think that regarding it as belief guiding would place impossible to meet demands on us. We're constantly exposed to evidence concerning all sorts of things, most of which we don't attend to, register, or process, and in which we have no interest. So I give 2 examples here concerning the color of the walls in the room, the number of people in it wearing glasses. I suspect that before you read those lines or heard me say them, you weren't entirely aware of the colors of the color of the walls in the room, and I bet even now that you have heard me, you have no idea how many people in the room are wearing glasses, even though the evidence is there for you to gather, and perhaps you've already gathered it. So if this evidence gives us reason to believe, for example, that that color is beige, so I didn't know what color the room was when I wrote this, but got it wrong, or that that number is 17, ought we to believe in accordance with it, even though that evidence is not registered with us? If we don't, are we guilty of epistemic irrationality? If we are so guilty, are we blameworthy? Those all seem like serious worries. And I think they're difficult questions because they involve both complicated facts about our psychology and neurophysiology and also tricky questions of epistemology. But I think, and so now here is the hand-waving part of the talk, I think they admit of an analysis that preserves the conclusions of the anti-reductionist arguments I've offered above in terms of distinctions between epistemic error, epistemic fault, and epistemic blameworthiness. That is, I think those 3 things are different and have to be clearly distinguished from one another. And we have to distinguish between what we could call ideal epistemic rationality, conceived independently of an agent's cognitive abilities and limitations, and non-ideal rationality, which takes proper account of the agent's cognition. Given these distinctions, I think we can establish the following theses. So now I'm hand-waving because I'm not really giving you arguments for this. I'm just saying it is my belief that we can establish these points armed with those points on the previous slide. So first, we should say, I think, if S has strong evidence E that P and recognizes that E supports P, then ceteris paribus, S epistemically ought to believe it, whatever S's goals happen to be. If that recognition outstrips S's cognitive abilities, then S cannot be blameworthy for failing to believe it. So I shouldn't blame you for not knowing the wall color before I mentioned it, even though you've witnessed the wall color multiple times in the last 3 days. Either because it was beyond your cognitive abilities or simply because you weren't paying attention, as I wasn't, right? So we must be careful to distinguish what S ought to believe from what she is praiseworthy or blameworthy for believing or not believing. And we should distinguish what S ideally ought to believe from what she's obliged to believe given her abilities and limitations. In any case, it seems to me, these worries do not undermine the anti-reductionist arguments I've given. Instrumental rationality can't be the whole story, I think. So this is the last slide. Conclusion by way of answers to two conference questions. These were on the conference flyer. First, while an adequate account of epistemic rationality not only can but should integrate categorical and instrumental considerations, the former can't be reduced to the latter. And two,
but I guess I wasn't seeing, so if I'm an instrumentalist, then I think that what it's rational to believe just is an instrumental notion, or what explains why something is rational to believe is that it's a good means to some end. And so then, of course, I'm going to think that if one requirement for it to be the case that it's rational to believe P given E because it's a good means towards the end of truth is that it's epistemically rational to believe that believing P given E is a good means towards the end of truth, then I'm just going to think, yeah, so I'm also epistemically rationally required to believe that believing P given E is a good means towards the end of truth. And why is that? Well, because believing that proposition is a good means towards the end of truth. So I'm just not seeing what the problem is.
Yeah, I appreciate the point.
Okay.
It's a good objection, and thank you for the comment. I think that. Oh, this is. Sorry, it's not here. Yeah, I got up and right. Sorry, I'm back now. Yeah, I think the worry is, at least my worry is, that when the instrumentalist makes that move,
Yeah.
she is not paying sufficient attention, or really any attention at all, to the different relation types that obtain between these things. And that's because she's presupposing that the only kind of relation type that's in the ballpark here is an instrumental one. Whereas I want to say the epistemic relationship that I'm trying to call attention to is really a different kind of thing. And her assimilating it to an instrumental relation is to not pay attention to the different kind of relation. What makes it an epistemic relation is that it gives me something, it gives me a reason to believe that P, which reason is itself not dependent on any of my epistemic goal, or any goals at all. So,
Can I follow up or no? It's very quickly.
does,
That is what I was going to say. Okay. But then that sounds to me a little bit question begging because I thought you were supposed to be giving the instrumentalist a reason to think instrumentalism is bad. But now it sounds like you're saying, hey, instrumentalist, your problem is that you're not appropriately recognizing that there are two different kinds of things here, epistemic rationality and instrumental rationality. And the instrument is like, yeah, that's my view. So what's the objection?
I appreciate the objection. It is a good objection, by which I mean it's an objection that I have to answer. I think that this is one of those many philosophical disputes where it's really easy to fall into, you're begging the question against me, no, I'm begging, that we can each accuse the other of question begging. And in these debates that I've participated in, that has indeed happened, where I accuse Loudon of doing it and he accuses me of doing it. And I could see that there's something to be said for both of us on those grounds. So I'm not sure what more I can say other than to point out that the relation between epistemic support is a different kind of relation than the relation between something like instrumental efficacy. And that, if I can't persuade you of that, then my argument is not going to persuade you.
I'm not sure I can articulate this very well, but it seemed to me that the presupposition of the way you were talking about it was that there has to be some instrumental reason related to this specific proposition and my specific goals right now for me to adopt it. Otherwise, it makes no sense for me to believe that Russell has one-handedness versus the other, even when I'm face to face with extremely strong evidence. But that seems to me like putting the locus of the instrumental value at the wrong level. And the instrumentalist could say, it's an overall utility that I've determined structuring my cognitive system, my epistemic practices in a certain way has huge utility for me or usefulness in a lot of different ways. That's why I do it. And then if that's right, if that is means end justified, then I adopt the policy. Whenever I'm face to face with very, very strong evidence that P, I'm going to go ahead and automatically believe that P, and I don't need any special reason to care about Russell's hands.
Well, that may be your kind of instrumentalist, but it's not Leet's kind of instrumentalist, because I showed you that quote where...
Well, but I wasn't linking myself to Leet. in
No,
any way.
okay, so then, okay, that would be a different instrumentalist position. So if the position now, the position you just articulated is something like this, I have a set of cognitive goals, I have adopted a set of epistemic policies that I believe will help me to achieve those goals overall, and one of them is to believe in accordance with my evidence when I'm paying attention to the evidence, right?
Let's call it overwhelming of evidence.
Okay, overwhelming evidence. Fine, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, then I think that kind of instrumentalism, at least as a middle position between the Kelly position and the Leet position, since Leet really doesn't want to allow that, right? So I'm not sure what to say about that. I mean, maybe you're right that that's a sensible middle position. I guess if you were really to defend this position, then I'd want to know, well, what is the status of this particular principle of yours, or the particular policy of yours, namely, believe that P when there's overwhelming evidence that P. Is it about the nature of the epistemic support relation that encourages you to adopt that policy? Or is it because adopting that policy will achieve your epistemic goals, whatever they are? If you say the second, then I'm still going to want to fight with you, because I'm going to say that this case, the one, believe that P when there's overwhelming evidence that P, is just a case in which what the right thing to believe is, epistemically speaking, is independent of those goals.
Given other things you say in the talk about evidence being itself a normative notion, and you and I agree about this, although I think there's probably a stronger case to be made against us than we're making it sound at certain moments.
No
but
doubt.
Given that you think that, you should think this view that was just articulated is cheating, or isn't vindicating the instrumentalist view, because it's building in the epistemically normative notion into the characterization of the rule itself.
Well, that's a good point, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like,
Cheating.
I give you these rules, you have instrumental reasons to follow, but it's not, it's taking advantage. It's like appealing to moral reasons in the statement of the norm and attempting to reduce
Right.
morality to instrumental rationality or something like that.
Yeah,
But
no,
that's a big
good.
conversation, the status of the evidence. So.
That's a good point.
I was wondering, right, so when you had this, basically we're using this principle, it was the idea that you said, we need something like epistemic rational reasons to say that something is instrumentally rational, right? Whether we couldn't perhaps make a move very similar to the one Quine did back then, right? So in his debate about what the right inference rules are, right? So whether we couldn't say, no, there's, at the end of the day, there is some discursive rationality where we all agree upon, so to say, that stops that regress, right? So for example, let's say a justification of logical inference rules, right? So I claim, these logical inference rules, they are only insofar justified as they are sound and complete with respect to our intuitions of what kind of sentences are true and not, etc. But here that this is, and you try to tell me, that's what you're providing epistemic reasons for the fact that this one is, namely kind of by proving something is incorrect, you provide epistemic reasons for believing that this is instrumentally rational. And then I think, perhaps not. Perhaps this is more like a discursive rationality, right? I mean, I provide arguments, but more not in the sense of that you should believe it, but rather that you should agree with me on these intuitions concerning semantics, and that this one should be sufficient, right? So that perhaps this is the end of your regress argument that we instrumentalists could provide. And of course we wouldn't be instrumentalist concerning, or pure instrumentalist concerning this discursive rationality of Friedman.
I'm not sure what to say about that, Peter. For one thing is I'm not entirely clear what the analogy is supposed to be between Quine's discussion concerning the regress of inference rules and this debate. I'm not worried about a regress at the moment. I'm only trying to establish that there's a kind of relation, namely an epistemic or a probative relation, that is different in kind from an efficacy relation or a means-ends relation, and that it would be a philosophical mistake not to acknowledge the first kind of relationship. Now, if you want to then sort of begin a regress by saying, yeah, but what you're calling epistemic reasons, they're just a version of instrumental reasons, and then I have to say, yeah, but what you just said is actually an epistemic reason, and we force each other down that rabbit hole, then perhaps there is some kind of analogy between the two cases. But I'm of failing to acknowledge that other kind of relationship. That's all. So I don't know if that helps. No, I guess not.
No, it does not. So
Yeah.
kind of my idea was the other way around, right? So I felt the way you argue shows to some extent that the instrument. So if you were right, then the instrumentalist would have insofar a problem that for every claim where I would claim, oh, here I have instrumental reasons to do P or something like this, you say, no, you should redescribe this. You have epistemic reasons to believe that you have instrumental reasons too.
I see.
Right, so and that's why you claimed I have to admit this additional probative reasons there, and I said no. On those base kind of when we take specific instances where I kind of would like to agree, like in the case of the logic case, right? So yeah, I provide reasons, but I'm saying no, but they are not purely epistemic reasons for the fact that this set of norms are instrumentally rational. No, this is kind of, I'm trying to establish another kind of force, namely this discursive agreement on some set of rules that however is not subject to probative, that is not probative or evidential support in this traditional sense. That was the idea.
Yeah, well, okay, thank you for the clarification. I'm not sure I have anything useful to say. I mean, what you're calling discursive agreement, I'm not sure that I want to put it in those terms. I mean, you might say I'm relying upon a semantic relationship between something like rationality and reasons. And maybe that's, but I don't see that there's any worry about agreement here, at least not in the way that you just said. But maybe I don't understand your point, so we'll talk about it at dinner. Yeah.
So one reason why I like epistemic teleological accounts and instrumentalist accounts kind of as well is because they explain the normativity so nice, and it's also because my intuitions with respect to the talk about reasons and ought, why isn't reasons more attached to permission? So I don't see where the normativity really comes from here, except one already has some very strong intuitions about reasons being normative.
Yeah, well, that is where it comes from. Reasons are normative. That's
they
that's
always
that's the
go hand-
positive view.
For example, in Kelly's case, if you understand reasons more attached to permission, I think some arguments might not even go through.
I was not discussing the problems you were discussing in your paper, so I didn't make any distinction between oughts and cans, permissions. So, and I'm quite open to the idea that there's an important distinction there to be drawn that might help me make my argument better. And it could be that some of them aren't oughts, but just permissions. That's possible. Of course, we've been talking in terms of cases in which there's overwhelming evidence that P. So in the case where there's overwhelming evidence that P, then I think ought is probably the right thing. It's not just okay to believe that P. in the face of when you have overwhelming evidence. If you have overwhelming evidence, you ought to believe it. So, so it may be that as the evidence goes down in power, the ought becomes more and more a permission rather than an obligation. I'm totally open to that.
So then I think if one takes, for example, Kelly's complaint that it's difficult to argue why we should aim at truth. Some people might think truth is simply fine and that's the way to go. Here you would say, well, reasons, it's fine, that's the way to go. So at the end, it's more about, yeah, intuitions and taste. Perhaps I don't
Well,
know.
I don't know about intuitions. I think in the end, since we're talking about epistemic rationality, yeah, I think in the end it's about reasons. It's about the normative force of reasons. That's the bottom.